Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 104th deck and it's titled I Got You a Gift. It's a Leviathan. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So very quickly, before we get into the deck tech itself, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. Of course, if none of these pique your interest, you can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That really does help out quite a bit. But if you're looking for a little bit more, you can follow us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All three of those ways are great ways to reach out to us, so if you ever have any questions, want to talk about some decks or some cards, those are great ways to do it. I'll also take suggestions and recommendations for cards you want to see turned into videos over there as well. And if you're looking to support us a little bit more directly, you can head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link, which is in the description of this video. Once you're over there, any cards you purchase, we get a little bit of a kickback from them, just as a thank you for sending you their way. And then finally, the most direct way that you can help support us and the way you can get access to a lot more extra content is, of course, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Over there, you get access to the deck lists an entire week early. You can get access to the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players talking and interacting with each other rather than just my own narration over a shortened version of it. You can get access to a Discord channel where we actually brew up the decks together, and also that's the first place I look for players when I'm starting to put together these games. So if you're interested in being on the channel and participating in some games, that's a great way to do it. You'll also get access to a card sent to you from me every single month as a thank you for all of your support. And finally, the most important thing, at least from my point of view, is that you are able to suggest any card to me once you've subscribed to the Patreon, and I will guarantee that that card will be turned into a video for the channel at some point. I can't make that guarantee for anybody else. I'm certainly welcome to take all of those suggestions, and I will do my best to turn them into videos, but I can't promise that they'll turn into videos for anyone but our patrons. So if that's something you're interested in, please do check us out over on Patreon. But other than that, I do have to shout out our 5 current patrons. So we have William Swiftfoot, we've got Doodle, Eric Way, Calvin Schmidt, and of course our newest patron, Jeff Winger. To the 5 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And if you would like your name to be mentioned alongside those 5, check out the Patreon. But without any further ado, let's jump into our deck. So first up, we got to talk a little bit about the random card of the week. And this week, it is going to be Aetherplasm. So Aetherplasm, I had honestly never seen this card before I found it with the random cards. And it is 2 blue for a 1/1 illusion. Whenever Aetherplasm blocks a creature, you may return Aetherplasm to its owner's hand. If you do, you may put a creature card from your hand into play, blocking that creature. So for the longest time, I had no idea what I wanted to do with this card. I didn't know what would be the best way to build around it. I wasn't sure if I wanted to focus on making our opponents attack so that we have to block and then put something big into play. But eventually, I actually decided to stay mono blue, and the commander that we're going with also cares about the creatures that we could possibly put into hand with Aetherplasm, because this week our commander is Braids Conjurer Adept. So Braids Conjurer Adept is 2 blue for a 2/2 legendary creature, human wizard. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player may put an artifact, creature, or land from their hand onto the battlefield. So with Braids in the command zone, we're already going to be filling our deck with a ton of huge creatures, meaning that if we ever get to the point where we have an Aetherplasm in play, our opponents are really going to have to think twice about attacking us, because we could just drop some huge bomb into play and all of a sudden kind of take over the game. So that is kind of what we're aiming to do. And since that has been mentioned already, when we get to our first major theme, you can probably already guess what it is. It is huge creatures. We want to take advantage of Braid's ability to put in one thing for free every single turn. Now, it is nice that we can put in lands sometimes, and we do have some artifacts that we'd want to put in sometimes too, but for the most part, we want to focus on the creatures, and we want things like Stormtide Leviathan, which is 5 blue, blue, blue for an 8/8 Leviathan with Island Walk, turning all lands into islands in addition to their other types, and preventing creatures without flying or Island Walk from attacking. So because everyone's going to have islands, Stormtide Leviathan kind of gets in for free. And then additionally, because we are a mono blue deck, we have a ton of flying, we have a ton of Island Walk, we are going to make sure that we can kind of do all the attacking and our opponents can't. So Stormtide Leviathan is a huge threat that with Braids we could get it down as early as turn 4, turn 5, and start swinging and kind of just causing general chaos and doing a ton of damage very, very quickly. And that is really what we want to be doing with any creature we drop down. We want them to come down very, very quickly because we want to make use of the Braids trigger. Now, unfortunately, Braids works for everybody. So if we cast Braids, someone else is going to be able to use Braids before we do if we just tap out, play her, and pass. And when I say someone else, I really mean the rest of the entire table, because everyone will get a chance to use her ability before it comes back to us. So our second theme is going to be making sure that we are the only ones who can use Braids. And the main way we're going to do that is through phasing. Because the way that phasing works is that the creature essentially is gone from the battlefield, so its abilities aren't going to trigger, and then it returns to play for us at the beginning of our untap step, which is before Braids would trigger for our upkeep. So if we use a card like Vanishing, which is 1 blue for an enchant creature, nowadays it would be called an aura, you can pay blue, blue, an enchanted creature phases out. So all it takes, we cast this on Braids, we untap with Braids phased out, upkeep, we put something huge into play, then we pay 2 mana, phase Braids back out. She can't be destroyed this way, nobody can make us sacrifice her, nobody can steal her, and most importantly, nobody can use her ability except for us. So we really get to make Braids trigger completely one-sided and make sure that we get to put in our huge creatures while nobody else gets to take advantage of it. And then finally, we come to our last theme, which is to help support these two general themes, and that is a control aspect. Because we are mono blue, we get access to a ton of counter spells and honestly a fair amount of removal, board wipes, protection, things like that. So we might as well take advantage of that and make sure that we are protecting our huge creatures. We're protecting our Braids. We're protecting our phasing abilities because we want to make sure that we are able to close out a game. And the most important way that we can close out a game in this deck is through combat. And if we can't control combat, then there's not much we can do. So we need to make sure that our opponents can't kill our stuff, they can't wipe our boards. If someone tries to win through a combo, we can just say no. And there aren't any combos in this deck, despite the fact that it is mono blue, and we probably could slide some in. I wanted to focus very heavily on just value and hitting people with giant creatures. So there is no combo in the deck, so we don't need the counter spells to protect that, but we do need it to protect ourselves from someone else's combo. So that is the general gist of the deck. Those are our 3 themes. And so the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the 3 cards that I want to highlight that I think are, if not the most important cards in the deck, definitely the most important when it comes to pushing us towards some value and eventually, hopefully, winning the game. So the first key card that I'd like to talk about is Sphinx of the Second Sun. Now, before I read this, I do want to preface that this is worded very strangely, so bear with me for just a second. But Sphinx of the Second Sun is 6 blue blue for a 6/6 Sphinx. It's got flying. And at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, you get an additional beginning phase after that phase. The beginning phase includes the untap, upkeep, and draw steps. So when I first read this card, I was thinking this happened after your second main phase, but in reality, this happens after your combat step. So you would go untap, upkeep, draw, first main phase, combat, then you would have the Sphinx of the Second Sun trigger, get an additional beginning phase, then you go to your second main phase, then you end your turn. So this is incredibly tricky, but it's incredibly important because Braids triggers in our upkeep. This now gives us 2 chances on our turn to make use of Braids' trigger, and even better, if we can put the Sphinx in for Braids' first trigger in our upkeep, we then get another one immediately on our turn before we even have to pass. So if for some reason we can't phase Braids out or we can't protect Braids, we're at least getting 2 creatures every turn instead of our opponents who are only getting 1. So it's not ideal that we couldn't protect Braids, but it is ideal that we're able now to draw an additional card, and we're able to untap all of our lands, so we can essentially do whatever we want in our first main phase, move into our second main phase, untap all of our lands, and then either do more in our second main phase or hold up all of the counter spells and removal and protection that we have in our deck to make sure that nobody can really interact with us. Kind of like we're taking an extra turn, but we don't actually get to take the extra turn. We don't get to play another land or get another combat step. We still just get the beginning phase, but it's still very much worth it in this deck. And I think I've probably talked enough about Sphinx of the Second Sun. I probably went on a lot longer on that one than I needed to, but I just think it's very important. So let's move on to our second key card, and in this case, that is going to be Wizard Class. Wizard Class is a personal favorite of mine, and every time I play it in a deck, it really just proves how powerful it is, because it is just 1 mana for an enchantment, a class, that says you have no maximum hand size, which is already very good in mono blue, but you can pay 3 mana, level it up to level 2, and when it becomes level 2, you draw 2 cards. That's just a divination, that's also just very good. And then, if you pay 5 mana and put it on level 3, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. If there's anything that mono blue is very good at, it is drawing cards. So if we're attempting to win the game through combat, we need to make sure that we are getting our creatures big enough to knock people out of the game, and Wizard Class is going to let us do just that, because every time we draw a card, we're putting a counter on a creature. Sphinx of the Second Sun lets us draw multiple cards in a turn. We have cards that can, pay X, draw X cards because, again, we're in mono blue, so we are really able to take advantage of this enchantment to make sure that we have ways to win the game, even more so than just our 6/6 and 7/7 creatures, because if we're hitting someone for 14, that's a lot better than hitting someone for 6, and that's not out of the ordinary with Wizard Class in play. So that is key card number 2, and key card number 3 is also a personal favorite of mine. This is Coveted Jewel. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I put Coveted Jewel into any deck that cares about combat, and honestly, even some decks that don't, just because I love it that much. But Coveted Jewel is 6 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards, tap, add 3 mana of any one color, and whenever one or more creatures an opponent controls attacks you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel. Untap it. Now, at first, this looks like a downside. Someone can just take the Coveted Jewel and all of a sudden we've lost out on the mana, we don't get to draw the cards. But in reality, because most of our creatures have things like Island Walk or Flying, we can very easily take the Coveted Jewel back from an opponent, and most likely we're going to be hitting them a lot harder than they're hitting us. They might swing in for 1 or 2 to take it, and we'll crack back for 6 or 7. Then we get to untap it, draw 3 cards, we've got 3 mana available. Coveted Jewel really puts in a ton of work if you have a lot of creatures that are evasive, like Sphinx of the Second Sun, and just gives us a great way to draw cards kind of for free just by playing our game plan and doing what we want to do. And the nice thing is, if we actually compare Coveted Jewel and Wizard Class, we can, if it's on level 3, take back the Coveted Jewel, draw 3 cards, put 3 counters on something, and that's all going to happen before combat damage is resolved, because it simply says that as long as the creature isn't blocked. So we actually get Coveted Jewel in combat before damage happens, which means we draw the cards, put 3 counters on something before the damage happens, doing even more to our opponents. So again, I probably talked about Coveted Jewel a little too much as well, but I absolutely love Coveted Jewel. It is by far one of my favorite cards in the entire game, and if you're not playing it, you should be. It is just that good. You can put it in pretty much any deck, and it will make it work. But before I go off on another tangent about Coveted Jewel, let's move on to our next set of cards that I want to talk about. And in this case, it's going to be our cool interactions. These are cards that aren't necessarily win conditions or the best cards in the deck, but they're cards that work very well together, and usually are cards that I just want to highlight because I think they're really cool. I think they're a ton of fun. So Our first set of cards that I want to talk about today are going to be Defiler of Dreams and Witness Protection. Now, admittedly, I could replace Witness Protection with any other card in this deck, well, any other blue card that's a permanent in this deck, but I chose Witness Protection because it's just 1 blue mana. And the reason that's important is because Defiler of Dreams is 3 blue for a 4/3 Phyrexian Sphinx. It's got flying. As an additional cost to cast blue permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost 1 blue less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of blue mana you pay. Whenever you cast a blue permanent spell, draw a card. Witness Protection, being a 1 blue mana permanent spell, means that we don't have to tap any mana for it. We can just pay 2 life. Then, when we cast it, because it's a permanent spell, we draw a card. And the reason that Witness Protection is so good in this deck is because it's an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green and white citizen creature with base power and toughness 1/1 named Legitimate Business Person. So the reason that Witness Protection is so good, other than the fact that it can just draw us a card and can be free, is that by enchanting any creature, we just make it completely useless. It's just a 1/1 with no other abilities, and we can put this on someone's commander, making it so that the commander doesn't die, so it can't go back to the command zone, but they still don't get access to their commander again. So all we've got to do is pay 2 life, and then we get to do pretty much what is just remove a commander, or I guess any other big thing. I usually lean toward commander just because it sticks around, and draw a card. So Defiler of Dreams is very good on its own in this deck because of how many blue permanents we have. Witness Protection is just a perfect removal spell and kind of an underrated removal spell, honestly, in my opinion. So a great pair of cards, very cool interaction, and with all of that, let's move on to our next cool interaction, this time between Hulking Metamorph and Runaway Together. And again, Hulking Metamorph, there's a couple of cards that I could have put into this slot instead, but I specifically wanted to talk about this one because I think it's kind of cool. So Hulking Metamorph is 9 mana for a 7/7 artifact creature shapeshifter. You may have Hulking Metamorph enter the battlefield as a copy of an artifact or creature you control, except it's an artifact creature in addition to its other types, and its power and toughness are equal to Hulking Metamorph's power and toughness. So you can pay it for 9, or you can pay 2 blue and make it a 3/3 instead of a 7/7, but it still has the same abilities. Now, if we put this into play with Braids, it automatically comes in as the 9 mana 7/7. So we'd have to cast it for 4 to get the 3/3, but honestly, that works out better for us. And we're going to pair that up with Runaway Together, which is 1 and a blue for an instant that says choose 2 target creatures controlled by different players, return those creatures to their owner's hands. This card also, I think, is a little underrated in Commander because it doesn't specify that one of those creatures has to be yours. So this is just 2 mana, bounce 2 of your opponent's creatures to their hands. But it can also be used to save our own stuff. So if for some reason someone tries to remove a creature, we can run away together, bounce one of their things, bounce one of our things, and then move on with the game. And the nice thing about doing that is if we bounce something like Hulking Metamorph, we actually get to put it back into play and maybe change the thing that it came into play as, letting us kind of tweak the board state a little bit, get some more value out of things, maybe get another enter the battlefield effect. So it's incredibly useful to use Runaway Together as both removal and protection. And if we're combining that with things like clone effects, then it just gets even better. So that is our last cool interaction. The next thing we're going to have to do is, of course, take a look at the budget of the deck since this is a budget show. And the total budget this week came out to $72.57. And the most expensive card in the entire deck is Paradox Haze. Paradox Haze is 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura, enchant player. At the beginning of enchanted player's first upkeep each turn, that player gets an additional upkeep step after this step. So very similar with what we talked about with Sphinx of the Second Sun earlier, getting 2 upkeeps because Braids triggers on upkeep is incredibly important because we need to make sure that we are getting more value than our opponents. So by being able to get 2 creatures or artifacts or lands or whatever, we are outvaluing what our opponents can do. However, this card is certainly not a mandatory include for this deck, so if you do need to trim it out, drop the price down, it's closer to about $66, you can definitely do that. It's not that important to the strategy. It's just a nice value piece. But of course, on the other hand, we do also have a card that I would recommend putting into the deck if you have a little bit of extra wiggle room. I'm not going to lie, it would fit into the budget of the deck right now, but I didn't include it just for the sake of budgets and for the sake of upgrades. So the card that I would recommend putting in and the card that I would recommend taking out this time is going to be Portal to Phyrexia. So Portal to Phyrexia is 9 mana for an artifact. When Portal to Phyrexia enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices 3 creatures, so that could be a board wipe on its own, and at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It's a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. There's a couple of important things about this card that make it very, very good in Braids. The first is the board wipe effect. It's very rare for mono blue to have access to something that can just force each opponent to sacrifice 3 creatures, so that is already very good on its own. Plus, we're able to put a creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield, but it doesn't say anything about when that creature dies. It doesn't get exiled, we don't give it back to its owner, nothing like that. So if someone kills it, we can just get that creature back again and again and again. And since we have so many big creatures that our opponents are most likely going to want to remove, we can keep getting them back and keep protecting them. And if for some reason our opponents have better creatures than we do, we can take those instead. So Portal to Phyrexia is phenomenal. And of course, it is 9 mana, but you have to remember, Braids can put in creatures, lands, or artifacts, so we can actually put Portal to Phyrexia into play with Braids as early as turn 4 if we ramp into it. And then if we're putting in Portal to Phyrexia, of course, we got to take something out. And in this case, I think the card to take out is Supplant Form, which is 4 blue for an instant. Return target creature to its owner's hand. You put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that creature. So I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't think this card is that great after playtesting it a few times. It never feels good to have to hold up 6 mana just to bounce a creature that your opponent controls and then get a token copy of it. Because for 6 mana, we could just be playing our own really big creature and not have to worry about possibly removing an opponent's creature. Or we could just play something like Unsummon, which is 1 blue mana for an instant to return a creature to its owner's hand. So it really just doesn't hit the mark in multiple ways, and I don't think it does nearly as much as we want it to be doing. So if you have a chance to swap it out for Portal to Phyrexia, I do think that is a much better include in this deck, even though it is a massive $18.72. So that is the only out-of-budget upgrade I have for this week. But of course, we're not quite done with our deck tech, because we have to see how this deck performs in a game. So we are going to run this deck up against 3 opponents this week and see how we do in a game. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest up front. These 3 opponents are going to be pretty brutal. I was not looking forward to facing down against Urza, Chief Artificer, Narset, Enlightened Master, and Niv-Mizzet Perun. All 3 of them are terrifying commanders. All of them include blue, so they're very easily able to work against our counter spells. So this is going to be a very tricky matchup. But let's talk about our opponents. So first up, we have Urza being played by Bilal. This is an Esper artifact deck. Bilal is all about Urza, all about his artifacts, so this was a natural fit for him and his playstyle. I think even though all 3 of these decks are very terrifying, I do think the Urza one is the most terrifying in my opinion, just because I know that out of all the players, Bilal knows his artifact synergies and strategies very, very well, and is probably going to have at least a few infinite combos in there. I imagine actually all of our opponents have infinite combos this week, but Urza just feels incredibly easy to get there with because it makes artifacts, it gives artifact creatures menace, so you're incentivized to play more artifact creatures, it has affinity, it kind of does everything an artifact deck wants. So that is priority number 1 for removing off of the table, in my opinion. Next up, we have Shawn playing Narset Enlightened Master. This is not intentionally taking an infinite amount of extra turns, but it is possible that he takes a bunch of extra turns and uses Narset to kind of cast things like extra turns, extra combat, and then Voltron pieces for free off of Narset's own ability. So hopefully we're able to put some form of blocks in front of Narset. I also imagine he has ways to make her unblockable and take, some extra turns or extra combat steps and just kind of knock people out from nowhere. So Also a very concerning deck, but I'm hoping we can kind of get there a little bit faster. And then finally, we have Jason playing Niv-Mizzet Perun. Once again, I know I'm repeating myself, a terrifying commander. There are plenty of ways that Niv-Mizzet Perun can go infinite with just 1 or 2 cards, so I imagine that Jason's going to be casting a ton of spells and trying to find ways to benefit off of it, draw a ton of cards. I wouldn't be surprised if he plays a lot of wheel effects, things that make us discard our hands and draw new hands, so that way he can continue to do damage. So very concerning set of opponents, but I am very interested to see how it can go. I'm curious to see if our mono blue strategy can hold up against Esper, Jeskai, and Izzet. We'll see. Let me know in the comments which of these commanders you think is probably going to be the most frightening for us to face and how you think we'll do. But without any more talking, let's get into the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Shawn, myself, and then Jason. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a Sea of Clouds and casts Preordain, scrying 2 and drawing a card. Shawn plays a Tranquil Cove, gaining a life. I play an Island. Jason plays a Castle Vantress, tapped. Bilal plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size, and casts Dimir Signet. Shawn casts Soul Ring and casts Thought Vessel, also gaining no maximum hand size, then plays a Swiftwater Cliffs, gaining a life. I play an Island and cast Sky Diamond. Jason plays a Mountain and casts Izzet Signet. Bilal plays a Swamp and then casts Azorius Signet. Shawn plays a Command Tower and casts his commander Narset Enlightened Master, letting him exile the top 4 cards of his library when she attacks and cast any non-creature spells from among them without paying their mana costs. I play an Island and cast my commander Braids, Conjurer Adept, letting each player put an artifact, creature, or land from their hand into play for free at the start of their turn. In Jason's upkeep, he puts a Goblin Electromancer into play with the Braids trigger, making all his instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast. Then he casts a Soul Ring, and also casts Serum Visions, drawing a card and scrying 2. Finally, he plays an Izzet Boilerworks, returning a mountain to his hand. In Bilal's upkeep, he puts in the Mightstone and Weakstone with Braids trigger, drawing 2 cards when it enters. Then he plays a Seat of the Synod and casts an Orzhov Signet, followed up by casting Spellskite, letting him pay a blue mana or 2 life to redirect any spells cast to the Spellskite. Then he casts his commander, Urza Chief Artificer, giving all his artifact creatures menace, and also creating a construct token in his end step that has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts he controls, which is currently 7. In Shawn's upkeep, he puts Whispersilk Cloak into play with Braids, then moves to equip the cloak to Narset, but Bilal pays 2 life with Spellskite to instead equip it to the Spellskite, giving it Shroud and Unblockable. Notably, he couldn't have done this since Spellskite isn't a legal target for the equip, as a player can only equip to creatures they control. Shawn then attacks Jason for 3 with Narset, triggering her own ability, but before it resolves, Shawn casts Mystical Tutor, searching his library for an instant or sorcery, in this case Temporal Manipulation, putting it on top of his deck. This lets him exile the Temporal Manipulation, Boros Charm, Hyena Umbra, and Whirlwind of Thought, being able to cast them until the end of turn. Then, Jason finally takes 3, and in his second main phase, Shawn casts Whirlwind of Thought, letting him draw a card for each non-creature spell he casts Boros Charm, doing 4 damage to Bilal and drawing a card, and also casts Temporal Manipulation, drawing a card and attempting to take an extra turn, but Jason has an answer, countering it with Force of Will, discarding a Whirlwind Drake to cast it for free. After that, Shawn plays a Clifftop Retreat, and casts Hyena Umbra on Narset, drawing a card, giving her Totem Armor and an additional +1/+1. He also casts a Staggering Insight, drawing a card, giving Narset lifelink, and letting him draw an additional card whenever she deals combat damage to an opponent. In my upkeep, Braids triggers, letting me put Nezahal Primal Tide into play, which draws me a card whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell. I then play an Island and cast the Phasing of Zhalfir, phasing Braids out until it leaves the battlefield. Jason plays a Mountain and casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards and putting 2 back on top of his library, and this also draws me a card with Nezahal. Then he moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 2. Bilal plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, and moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 7 with his Construct. Then at the end of turn, he makes another Construct with Urza, bringing him to 8 artifacts. On Shawn's turn, he overloads Vandal Blast, drawing him and I both a card, attempting to destroy all artifacts, but Bilal has a response, countering it with Rewind, drawing me another card, and untapping 4 of his lands when it resolves. Shawn then casts Brainstorm, drawing me a card while he draws 4 and puts 2 back on top of his library, plays a Vivid Meadow, and attacks Jason for 5 with Narset, exiling Ghostly Prison, Mystic Confluence, and 2 islands. Then, when she does damage, he draws another card and gains 5 life. In his second main phase, he casts the Ghostly Prison, drawing a card, drawing me a card, and making each opponent pay 2 mana to attack him. He also cast Mystic Confluence, drawing a card, drawing me a card, returning Bilal's 2 constructs to his hand, and returning Nezahal to my hand. In response, though, I activate Nezahal to discard 3 cards and exile him, returning him to play tapped in the next end step. Finally, Shawn casts Aqueous Form on Narset, giving her unblockable and letting him scry 1 when he attacks. Then, my Nezahal returns to play in the end step. When I draw for my turn, the phasing of Zhalfir goes to stage 2, phasing out Jason's Goblin Electromancer. Then I play a Mystic Sanctuary, putting High Tide from my graveyard back on top of my library, and then I cast a Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards, but also allowing any player to gain control of it when they attack me with an unblocked creature. After that, I cast a Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size, and also cast a Swiftfoot Boots. Jason plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1, and then passes. Bilal plays a Watery Grave untapped, paying 2 life, and attacks me for 0 with his unblockable Spellskite, gaining control of the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. Then in the second main phase, he casts All Is Dust, making each player sacrifice all colored permanents. This draws me a card, and then I activate Nezahal, discarding 3 cards to exile him until the end of turn, then the board wipe resolves. Once that's happened, Bilal recasts his commander Urza, creating another construct when he moves to his end step. Shawn plays a Buried Ruin and recasts his commander Narset. He then casts Eel Umbra, drawing me a card and giving Narset +1/+1 and Totem Armor. In my untap step, Braids phases in, letting me put Hullbreaker Horror into play when she triggers during my upkeep. This lets me return target non-creature permanent or spell to its owner's hand whenever I cast a spell. Then I play an island and cast Engulf the Shore, returning all creatures to their owner's hands if their toughness is less than 6 since I control 6 lands. This also triggers the Horror, returning Bilal's 8/8 construct to his hand. I then equip the Horror with the Swiftfoot Boots, giving it haste and hexproof, and move to combat, attacking Bilal and Shawn both for 7, reclaiming the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. In my second main phase, I cast Wizard class, gaining no maximum hand size again, and returning Whispersilk Cloak to Shawn's hand. I then level up the Wizard class, drawing 2 cards, and at the end of turn, Jason casts a Pull from Tomorrow for X=5, drawing 5 cards and discarding a card, while I also get to draw a card. In Jason's untap step, his Goblin Electromancer phases back in, then he plays a Mountain and casts a Thran Dynamo, drawing me a card, and also casts a Consecrated Sphinx, letting him draw 2 cards whenever an opponent draws a card. Finally, he suspends a Wheel of Fate with 4 time counters on it. When Bilal draws for turn, Jason also draws 2 cards. Then Bilal plays an island and casts a Shimmer Dragon, which has hexproof since he controls 4 or more artifacts and also lets him tap 2 artifacts to draw a card. He then recasts Spellskite and also casts Liquimetal Torque, letting me draw a card with Nezahal. But in response, I cast Pongified to destroy Bilal's Spellskite, giving him a 3/3 Ape token instead, while also using the Hullbreaker to return Jason's Consecrated Sphinx to his hand. In response to that, Bilal casts a Dovin's Veto to counter my Pongify, saving his Spellskite while still returning Jason's Sphinx to his hand. However, this does draw me a card with Nezahal first, letting Jason also draw 2 cards. Shawn plays an Exotic Orchard and casts Kaikar Wind's Fury, letting him sacrifice a spirit to make a red mana, and also create a 1/1 spirit token whenever he casts a non-creature spell. After that, he casts a Scroll Rack, allowing him to swap any number of cards in his hand with that many cards on top of his deck, also drawing me a card and making himself a spirit token. He then casts Talisman of Conviction, making another spirit, letting me draw a card, and casts his own Liquimetal Torque, making another spirit and drawing me another card. Then he sacrifices 3 spirits to cast a Darksteel Ingot, making a replacement spirit and drawing me a card, and also recast Whispersilk Cloak, making yet another spirit and drawing me yet another card. I play a Hall of the Storm Giants and cast Archetype of Imagination, giving all my creatures flying and preventing my opponent's creatures from having or gaining flying. This triggers the Hullbreaker, returning Spellskite to Bilal's hand, but he does tap it and his Torque first to draw a card thanks to Shimmer Dragon. Then I move to combat, attacking Jason and Bilal both, each for 7 damage. In Jason's upkeep, he removes a time counter from Wheel of Fate, plays a Riverglide Pathway, then casts Windfall, making each player discard their hands and draw cards equal to the greatest number of cards in a player's hand. This draws me a card with Nezahal, and then Shawn responds by activating Scroll Rack, putting 5 cards from his hand on top of his library and drawing 5 cards. Then the wheel resolves and we all draw 15 cards, since I had 15 cards in hand. Once that's resolved, Jason casts Spellbook, gaining no maximum hand size, drawing me a card, casts Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size again, drawing me another card, and then casts his commander Niv-Mizzet Perun, letting him draw a card whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, and also doing 1 damage to any target when he draws a card. In response though, I cast Dig Through Time, looking at the top 7 cards of my library, putting 2 of them into my hand. This triggers the Hullbreaker, returning Niv-Mizzet to Jason's hand. After that, he casts Lightning Greaves, drawing me a card, and cast Wayfarer's Bauble, drawing me another card. At the end of turn, Bilal casts Slaughter Pact to destroy my Archetype of Imagination, drawing me a card when it's cast. In response, I cast Slip Out the Back, phasing out the archetype, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, and returning Kaikar to Shawn's hand. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Thought Monitor, drawing 2 cards, then casts Tezzeret, Master of the Bridge, giving all of his creatures and planeswalkers affinity for artifacts, drawing me a card. He also casts Karn Liberated, drawing me another card, and casts Karn Silver Golem, letting him pay a mana to turn any artifact into a creature until the end of turn. This lets him turn my Swiftfoot Boots into a creature, unequipping them from the Hullbreaker Horror, and then allowing him to activate Karn's -3 ability, exiling the Horror. In response though, I cast Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards and putting 2 back on top of my library, but more importantly, returning the Horror to my hand with its own trigger. Then, Bilal casts Urza, Lord High Artificer, creating a 9/9 construct token and letting him tap his artifacts to make blue mana. After that, he activates Tezzeret's +2 ability, doing 9 damage to each opponent and gaining 9 life since he controls 9 artifacts. He moves to combat, attacking me for 5 with Shimmer Dragon, gaining control of Coveted Jewel, untapping it and drawing 3 cards. Then in his second main phase, Bilal casts and activates Mindslaver, sacrificing it to take control of my next turn. In Shawn's upkeep, he activates Scroll Rack, swapping 9 cards in his hand with 9 cards on top of his library, then plays an island and recasts his commander Narset. Once that's resolved, he casts Alrund's Epiphany, making 2 1/1 bird tokens and taking an extra turn after this one, also drawing me a card. On Shawn's extra turn, he plays an island and equips Narset with Whispersilk Cloak, giving her Shroud and Unblockable. He moves to combat, attacking me for 3 with Narset, triggering her own ability, but he activates Scroll Rack in response, swapping 2 cards in his hand with the top of his library, then her ability resolves, exiling World at War, Relentless Assault, Saheeli Sublime Artificer, and Arcane Flight before I take the 3 damage from Narset. In his second main phase, Shawn casts Saheeli Sublime Artificer, letting him make a 1/1 servo token whenever he casts a non-creature spell, drawing me a card, and also casts Arcane Flight on his spirit, giving it +1/+1, flying, making a servo, and drawing me another card. Then he casts Relentless Assault, untapping Narset, getting another combat step, making another servo, and drawing me another card. This lets him attack me for 3 with Narset this time, exiling a Plains, Burnished Heart, Blackblade Reforged, and Embercleave. Once he moves to his next main phase, he re-equips Whispersoaked Cloak to a bird and casts Blackblade Reforged, drawing me a card, and equipping it to Narset, giving her +9/+9 since he controls 9 lands, then re-equips Narset with the cloak. He also casts Embercleave, drawing me a card and equipping it automatically to a bird, giving it +1/+1 and double strike. Then, finally, he casts World at War, untapping its creatures and getting an additional combat step, drawing me yet another card. He attacks me for 20 total damage, but before the damage, Bilal activates Karn, turning Blackblade into a creature, making it fall off of Narset so that Shawn can only hit me for 9, keeping me in the game and letting Bilal take my next turn. This time on attacks, Narset exiles a Plains, Preordain, Commander Sphere, and a Fairy Conclave. In his next main phase, Shawn casts the Commander Sphere, making a Servo, drawing me a card, then immediately sacrifices it to draw himself a card, and also cast Preordain, scrying 2, drawing a card, making a Servo, and drawing me another card. When I untap for my turn, Archetype of Imagination phases in, and then we do the best we can over webcam to have Bilal control my turn. Unfortunately, this means we have to reveal my 33 card hand, and once that's out of the way, Bilal has me play an island and recast my own Hullbreaker Horror, equipping it with Swiftfoot Boots to give it hexproof and haste. Once that's resolved, I cast a Soul Ring, returning Shawn's Blackblade to his hand, and after that I move to combat, attacking Jason for 18 total damage, all of which is unblockable thanks to the archetype, knocking him out of the game. After damage, I cast Reality Shift to exile my own Hullbreaker Horror, manifesting the top card of my library and returning Saheeli to Shawn's hand. Finally, Bilal has me move to my end step and then discard 3 cards to Nezahal, exiling him and returning him in the next end step. Unfortunately, he's able to respond to that trigger by making me discard 3 more cards, eventually forcing me to discard my entire hand except for an island. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Vault of Whispers and casts Arcane Signet before activating Tezzeret's -3 ability, returning Mindslaver from his graveyard to his hand. He activates Karn's -3 ability to exile Archetype of Imagination, then casts and activates Mindslaver, sacrificing it to take control of Shawn's next turn. He moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 7 with both of his pliers, and then Shawn blocks the dragon with a bird token, killing his token, but only taking 2 damage. In Bilal's second main phase, he recasts his commander Urza and makes another construct in his end step. This lets Bilal use all of Shawn's creatures to knock me out in combat on his turn, and then Bilal's able to untap and knock Shawn out on his following turn, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. We got so close to being able to close out the victory in that one. Unfortunately, I think if it weren't for the Mindslaver, we probably would have just won the game because we had so many removal spells in our hand, we had so many interaction pieces in our hand, that if we hadn't had our turn taken by Bilal, we could have eliminated one person every turn and kept the others kind of at bay until we were able to move on and hopefully win the game. But a very timely Mindslaver kept us from winning. But I do think our deck did very well otherwise. I think we put a lot of pressure on board very early. We made sure that we were the only ones benefiting from Braids and just kind of doing exactly what our deck wanted to do. We just didn't quite have time to wrap things up. Jason, unfortunately, got off to a bit of a slow start, couldn't find the colored mana he needed to cast his commander very early on, so he struggled a bit to get into the game, and then finally when he was able to get into the game, I was kind of able to shut him down with Hullbreaker Horror, so not a great showing from Niv-Mizzet, unfortunately, but we did see how it could be very, very powerful. Shawn also had a phenomenal showing and was very close to winning the game on his own. I think that if he had been able to knock out Bilal instead of attacking me the turn when he really went off and took an extra turn and did a ton of damage, I think that he may have been able to win the game. I think that going after Bilal a little sooner would have been better for him, but he had no way to know that in the long run. And it was very cool to see Narset doing its thing, even though it was very scary at the time. So a very cool showing from Shawn and Narset. And then finally, of course, we got to talk about our winner. Bilal did a phenomenal job just kind of racking up a ton of artifacts. He started playing artifacts as early as turn 1 and just never really stopped. And I think that led him to a win, especially once he played Urza. I think it's Chief High Artificer, Lord High Artificer. The mono blue one that lets his artifacts tap for blue mana was incredibly powerful and is just a wild card to see go off. So very cool showing by all of our opponents. Very cool showing by us, of course, as well. And a congratulations to Bilal for winning. So let me know in the comments what you thought of the game, if you thought there were any misplays that happened. I know we made a mistake with the spell skite. We did address that in the game and decided that we had gone too far to actually change anything, but we did notice it eventually. So let me know what you think. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you can, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.